Thank you for the introduction. As Marius just said, my name is Ryan, and I'll be presenting FFXE. So just a little bit of motivation to start off with. As we all probably know, embedded systems, and particularly bare metal embedded systems, are often pretty major components in critical systems, and that makes firmware security for these systems a significant concern. Now, unfortunately, vendors like to keep their firmware closed source, so security auditing usually has to be done through with just the binary. So it's binary analysis, and I'm sure many of you are familiar. But yeah, the security auditing using binary analysis is usually done in a pretty black box manner. It's manual, it's human in the loop, it's pretty tedious, and so we like to rely a lot on automated program analysis techniques. But a lot of these techniques depend on the quality of the control flow graph that you are able to extract from the binary. And so that makes control flow graph recovery a pretty critical intermediate step before you can get to a lot of the nitty-gritty in the program analysis. And so this is kind of what we're focusing on in this work. So embedded systems, in particular, tend to have a callback pattern for registered interrupt handlers. This pattern is where programmers have defined some handler function that they want to be triggered on some hardware event. So they call a registration function from the SDK. They give the function their handler pointer. And then when the interrupt service routine fires, it then calls back their function. So this is kind of characterized by some asynchronicity. So you can register this function in the main thread, and it gets called back in an ISR thread. And yeah, for all intents and purposes, I'm calling them threads, even though they're slightly different. But yeah, so it's characterized by asynchronous memory accesses, and that makes it particularly difficult to resolve the indirection that results from this, because your branch location or your branch target isn't solely determined by the local context of the indirect branch. So for this, we think that runtime information might be helpful, since you can calculate it, put the target in the correct destination, and then see if you can find it from there. So we took an approach based on forced execution, which is a fairly old technique introduced by Xu, Sun, and Su in 2009. It's fairly straightforward. The idea is to concretely execute all conditional branch paths in a DFS manner. So for an example, if we start at some entry basic block 0, you just concretely execute, and as you encounter blocks, you add them to the CFG. When you hit some conditional branch, you take the path that you were going to take anyways, add that block, and then for the path that you did not take, you put the execution context that corresponds to that path onto some context queue. Then you just continue executing as you would normally, adding the blocks that you encounter to your CFG until you hit some stopping point, at which point you go back and then continue executing from a previously saved state until you encounter blocks you've seen before. So that's kind of a high level. There's more details. You can see the original paper for all of the details on that. But there is a problem with the original algorithm as presented. The assumption here is that the indirect branch, or most indirect branches, are completely determined by a control flow path to this indirect branch. The interrupt handler pattern kind of violates this because, as we saw, the actual target of the branch is calculated and saved in a different thread from where it's called. So if you try to run a forced execution as normal, you'll end up jumping to, well, probably 0, which is not what we want. So we implemented the Forced Firmware Execution Engine, which tries to resolve this by accounting for these asynchronous memory accesses, and basically just tries to resume forced execution from volatile memory reads. So this is the kind of algorithm at a high level. It looks a little weird, but we're going to step through it. So first, we load the firmware and pre-execute the reset handler into some emulator For our prototype, we use the Unicorn CPU emulator, and this just kind of sets up all of the context to allow, to set up the global variables in RAM and all of that. Then we we conduct forced execution on each of the known ISRs. So we run forced execution on each one until completion. And then as we do this, we record any memory accesses made during these passes as volatile memory. When we read from this volatile memory address, we back up the emulator execution state at those instructions so that we can later restore if those locations get written. So once we've done the force execution on each of the ISRs, we then move on to follow forced execution from the main entry point. And this is pretty much vanilla forced execution, except that we're also paying attention to the memory accesses. On writes to volatile memory, which we've saved in this other dictionary, we can resume or just add the context corresponding to that memory read onto our context queue. And we modify that context to have the written values updated in the context, so that when you resume the execution, you have this updated value in that memory location that is then allowed to potentially influence any indirect branches that will rely on it. So then, once you've done this, you kind of just continue the algorithm, the regular forced execution algorithm, popping contexts off of the queue and just doing everything. If we're in the ISR context and we encounter new blocks, we update our list of volatile memory locations, and we sort of just ping pong back and forth between the two contexts until we run out of contexts in our queue. So by the end of this, what we should end up with is a fully reachable control flow graph. So every block in the resulting control flow graph will be reachable from a known entry point. And then lastly, this is a little architecture specific, but we can optionally conduct additional forced execution passes on ISRs if we detect writes to interrupt enable registers that are like memory mapped, or we encounter a wait for event or wait for interrupt instruction. And this is just to increase our potential coverage, get more of the memory states that might affect indirect branches. So our primary evaluation is looking at callback resolution. How good is FFXE at resolving edges to these callback functions? For this, we created a test set based on samples from the Nordic NRF5 SDK. We chose this SDK because they really like using the callback pattern for their peripheral driver modules. So we grab 8 samples and then compile at 4 different optimization levels for a total of 32 binaries. And then we manually looked at each of the binaries and found a total of samples, and found a total of 24 callback functions. So 24 across samples, not across binaries. The number for the binaries is, you can kind of see it in the table here, but yeah. So the results in the table, it's a little ugly, but each entry in the table has 3 numbers. The rightmost number corresponds to the number of known callback handlers in the firmware sample, which is indicated by the column on the left. The middle number indicates how many entry basic blocks were found that correspond to those handlers. And then the leftmost number indicates how many edges were actually resolved that lead to those entry blocks. And as you can see, we compared against a few other tools, Anger, Ghidra, and then the original FFXE. And we find that pretty much only our algorithm is able to consistently get edges to these locations. You'll note that there are a few like a few edges in other tools that are found, but upon like deeper analysis, these turn out to be well, erroneous fall-through edges. And so it turns out that it's pretty much only our algorithm that successfully finds these edges. We also look at the overall CFG comparison. So like total blocks and total edges that are found between all of the tools. This bar chart is also perhaps a little ugly, but it's basically a whole bunch of Venn diagrams that show the overlap between blocks and nodes found by FFXE and the other engine and sort of their overlap. So blue is FFXE only, red is the other engine. You'll note that for the static techniques in red, that the blocks and edges found by the static techniques tend to outnumber FFXE. This is kind of as expected because they're using linear sweep and are based more on pattern recognition. So they're good at finding blocks like randomly in the blob. However, if you look at reachability, which is kind of shown in blue, this is the reachable subgraph of the of the found CFG, and you'll find that there's significant complementary coverage that FFXE is able to provide, so edges that lead to more blocks. We also do this evaluation on some real-world firmware with similar results. Mostly, we want to note that, again, we have some complementary coverage here. So FFXE can potentially help increase the reachability of CFGs here. And yeah, so 10 real-world firmware on 5 different hardware targets, right? All right, so in conclusion, we designed FFXE to resolve edges to interrupt callback functions, which are a very common occurrence in bare metal firmware. And then we evaluated FFXE's ability to resolve these edges and showed that pretty much only FFXE is able to find them. And then we demonstrated how FFXE can provide complementary coverage to existing tools. Yeah, the GitHub link is there. We've had our artifacts evaluated, and if you have any questions, you can feel free to talk to me after as well. Thanks.